I'll mention that if you saw an early draft of the agenda, it said that I was going to do like a retrospective looking at like version 1 of ArchivesSpace and the current version of ArchivesSpace. But then Marcella suggested this, and honestly, it was much better than anything I could have come up with, which would have just been like a self-indulgent look at stuff I think is interesting. So I think this instead will be very useful. And then after I think this will transition us nicely into our discussion topic. So I went ahead and tallied up the winners. We have 4, and I'll go over this again. But as Marcella is talking about look back over the past few years or the past 10 years, it's exciting to think about what we hope to see in ArchivesSpace in the next 10 years, or like, let's just say 1 year. We don't, yeah, 20 years. All right, so, all right, so, but next up we have Marcella Huggard from the University of Kansas, and Marcella is presenting We've Come So Far, Data Migration and Cleanup at the Kenneth Spencer Research Library. Marcella has been the manuscripts processing coordinator at the Kenneth Spencer Research Library, part of the University of Kansas Library, since 2015. The University of Kansas became an ArchivesSpace member shortly after version 1.0 was made available in 2013. The library started migrating accession records from an Access database and EAD finding aids in 2014. This presentation will focus on their cleanup before and after importing data into ArchivesSpace. Over the past 9 years, while processing new materials and creating new finding aids at the same time, staff in the cataloging and archival processing department have had to touch every single resource record, fixing such pieces of data as containers, agents, subjects, intellectual hierarchy, dates, extents, notes, and in some cases, the entire finding aid. KU Library's implementation is now at the point that they are turning to enhancing data, not just mitigating it to make it more usable. Marcella?
So when I did my outline for this presentation, I had 45 minutes of content, and I'm going to shrink it down to 20. So wish me luck. So thank you, everybody, for sticking around and listening to my retrospective on data migration and cleanup at the Kenneth Spencer Research Library. I want to thank Jessica for accepting this talk. And I have been with the Spencer Research Library since fall 2015, so some of what I'm going to be talking about, I didn't have to deal with myself. So I also need to thank my supervisor, some of you probably know her from various training opportunities, Malaka Kotman, for pulling together a lot of data, images, and probably reliving some traumatic memories from the very beginnings of our ArchivesSpace journey. I know I definitely had a lot of traumatic memories putting together this presentation. So this is just a quick high-level agenda for my talk today. I'll start with a little bit about Spencer, as we often call our library building, and then talk about our journey in importing and cleaning up accession records, finding aids, and other data to make better use of the collection management system capabilities of ArchivesSpace. So the Kenneth Spencer Research Library at the University of Kansas has been in existence since 1968, when our building was built. However, 2 of our collecting areas were established long before that. Another established not too long beforehand, and then our final one established the year after our building was opened. In other words, we are yet another institution that had a lot of stuff described in paper long before computers and the internet were a widely used thing. Around 2000, there were some major retirements at Spencer, and the building was thoroughly reorganized. Instead of each collecting area being in charge of everything associated with its collections, from acquisitions to outreach and reference, they created a separate reader or public services team and a separate processing team. Around 2009, that processing team became part of the library's overall cataloging department, so I am a unit lead within the cataloging and archival processing department. Also in the early 2000s, the folks in processing began creating EAD XML finding aids, both for newly processed collections and for all of those legacy collections that had been acquired decades before. Not all, we are actually still creating finding aids for some of those legacy collections, but they did a really great job, so that by the time 2013, 2014 rolled around, Spencer had over 3,000 published finding aids online, all hosted locally on our own XTF server. So I don't know why we didn't, go out for Archon or Archivist Toolkit or one of those collection management systems before ArchivesSpace, but by the time 2014 rolled around, Malaka, who is the head of the cataloging and archival processing department, was figuring out how to import accession records and our EAD XML finding aids into ArchivesSpace. So importing accession records was a one-time deal. We only actually had accession info in an Access database for 2 out of our 4 main collecting areas, and most of it was really just for one of those collecting areas. The database had forms to fill in to track individual accessions, as well as to create records for individual donors, and those 2 tables linked so that staff and students could attach donor names to individual accessions. This actually led to some cleanup that we had to do in ArchivesSpace because somehow, we have no idea how, somebody who had given us exactly one accession, their name got attached to hundreds of accessions, and all of that got imported into ArchivesSpace. So again, we had to clean that up too. Malaka exported the data from an Access database, and she noted when she was giving me this info that the fields go to the right way further than you can see in the screenshot, but you kind of get a sense of the kind of data that she was pulling. And again, that's super tiny, so look at the slides when they come out later. She exported the data from the previous screen into Excel and was then able to use ArchivesSpace's accession import template, which already existed even then, to pull the data into ArchivesSpace. So from this screenshot, you can see the mapping that Malaka was doing to make sure she imported what she could into the appropriate fields. In the end, after lots of testing, she broke the import process into 2 separate files, one for singular accessions and one for collections that had multiple editions, and I never got around to asking her why she had to break it up that way, but she did. So all of that was done by the time I showed up in October 2015. We did a couple cleanup projects related to accessions. One was linking them to resource records. Another was actually getting proper dates in for all of that stuff that got in the initial import process so that we could actually go, here are all of the accessions that came in 1985, at least in that one collecting area. And then we are also creating accession records for legacy collections that are either completely unprocessed or they just have never had an online presence, so that we have something electronic to hook onto, and then we can spawn resource records from those accession records. So like I said, accession records were simple, straightforward, done. Our finding aids, however, that's where the bulk of our cleanup has occurred. So as you saw on the previous screen, we were no strangers when importing EADs to error messages in the logs. There were several different reasons why an EAD might have failed during the import process, and I'm going to go through just some of the bigger glitches that we ran into more frequently. So I think part of the problem was there was a game of telephone occurring in processing in Spencer. Over the 10+ years that folks were creating EAD, people who had a little more institutional memory but no real training or background were teaching new folks what they had learned from previous folks who had left, and it just spiraled. There were also some students and staff who felt really confident in what they were doing in XML, so they would decide to do things without apparently realizing that there were going to be style sheets applied later to do some formatting that they decided they wanted to do in the raw XML. So everybody was creating EADs that they validated just fine, they went up on the XTF server just fine, but of course ArchivesSpace was not happy with those. So you can see some of the common error messages that everyone was running into when they were trying to import without doing any fixes whatsoever in the raw XML beforehand. And I'm going to run through each of these in a little more detail. So ArchivesSpace, as you probably know, has a pretty defined way to handle extents. You need a number and you need a type to go with that number. Extents in our finding aids, however, tended to be really loosey-goosey, or there was no extent information whatsoever. Good luck, researcher, you have no idea what you're going to be getting. Sorry. So folks at a minimum would have to add the required elements from ArchivesSpace into the EAD before import. We also had a lot of really weird extent types that migrated into ArchivesSpace, and Malaka, as our system administrator, has periodically had to clean those up. And this screenshot I took just like a couple weeks ago, so we still have some weird ones that have migrated back in or something, I'm not even sure. So there was a shortcut that staff and students used to take to get finding aids online more quickly. And again, it worked fine in XML, but it wasn't so great from a physical collections perspective or from ArchivesSpace's perspective. So folks would create a box divorced from the folders inside. This will come back to haunt you in a minute, leading to extraneous layers of component hierarchy in the XML. So you see we've got a CO3 that just says box 1, and then we have a whole bunch of CO4s that are all the folders inside that box. So ArchivesSpace doesn't like components that have neither a title nor a date. We lucked out in that a former metadata librarian at KU, Eric Radio, actually created a script that ran through and added untitled to all of those box components, which staff would later have to clean up either by removing the extra layer of hierarchy or transforming it into something more intellectually useful. Intellectual arrangement has gone through phases of popularity at Spencer, and I'm not going to go into more details about that now. But sometimes it was useful to have that layer, sometimes. And you can also see that the CO1 level has an intellectual level of series, but nothing below it does. And of course, that CO1 also has neither a title nor a date. So again, ArchivesSpace would import all of those other components as other level, and somebody would have to go in and fix them one by one manually unless they remember to do it before importing, and adding something like level equals file. Later on, actually, we had our IT staff. They were able to do a batch find and replace background job so that folks would just have to clean up in the resource level, in the resource record, like here's where the series are, here's where the subseries are. They'd run that background job and everything else would be turned into file, and it made our lives so much easier after we got that. So in the 1.x versions of ArchivesSpace, and I'm honestly not sure when this got resolved, it really didn't like the term item when used for an instance rather than for level of description. At some point with testing, Malaka figured out that we could add things that had been given that instance type if we added a space after the M, as in container type equals item space close quotation close caret. Sometimes I really questioned why processors were using item instead of some other container type, however. I can understand for volumes and 3D objects, but sometimes they were using it for file folders of documents, as in this example, and I'm actually really hoping that they are in folders because I haven't actually gone to look at the box and make sure that they're not just loose in there. So these days, I always urge my staff to use case, object, or volume for audiovisual materials, three-dimensional objects and textiles, and for volumes. But we do still occasionally run into situations where item still seems like the best container type, notably for when we're working with our glass plate negative collections. And then there were other issues that cropped up because ArchivesSpace is a complicated relational database system, can do things that flat or static finding aids cannot do, like automatically add commas between folder titles and dates, so it's not a big deal, it just looks bad. For a while, we were again fixing this manually, either in XML before import or one archival object at a time after import. Eventually, we did run a script that took care of most of the issues. It didn't affect anything that was inside quotations at the end of the folder title, but again, it was faster cleanup that we didn't have to do manually. Our dates also all imported as expression only, not in the begin and end fields. This continues to be an issue, especially for the finding aids that are huge and have hundreds, if not thousands, of archival objects. My workaround, because we haven't done any kind of scripting to fix that, has just been to add begin and end date information at the series or the subseries level so that there's something that researchers can hook onto if they're trying to search on dates in the public interface. So then, in the middle of all of this cleanup, to import into ArchivesSpace, ArchivesSpace decided to release version 1.5, which completely updated container functionality. So remember how Spencer was adding things in a weird hierarchical way that divorced the folders from the boxes? We were going to be in so much trouble. So some of our issues, our IT folks, again, namely Tom Shorrock, were able to resolve by generating a fake barcode to link together top containers of boxes with their child containers of folders. This worked really well for a lot of our collections. Again, we were dealing with over 3,000 finding aids. So anything that had really straightforward, or actually no intellectual hierarchy, just fine. Anything that had a really straightforward intellectual hierarchy, as in everything within a box was all in the same series, was fine. But there were other cases where that wasn't fine. So if we had a collection that there were multiple series within the same box, or we had multiple box ones within the same series, and I won't go into why we would do that, that box would get broken apart into two boxes. So you can see that with this tube example. All of these architectural drawings are within the same tube 52, but if you look at the barcodes, you see that they're in sequence. So ArchivesSpace, when we ran this, thought they were all in different top containers. So a staff person had to go in and manually merge them all back together. So the other issue where we might have multiple box ones within the same series. Our barcode generator would consolidate all of those top containers if they were all co-located within the same series and had the same indicator information. And it wasn't necessarily using series, it was just using the next layer below the resource level. and going, okay, everything within this, we're going to assume are in all the same containers. So this continues to be an area of cleanup in our university archives record groups. Processing staff were creating the finding aids after the fact. Archive staff didn't necessarily add box indicators if there was a single box for a series, a subseries, what have you. Processing staff would therefore add an indicator so that there would be something to hook onto, was the thought. They also didn't have any records management background, so they didn't really understand how the intellectual hierarchy worked within a records management perspective. So we still have lots of finding aids for record groups that have multiple box ones like this, where you can see they've all got the same barcode. So ArchivesSpace thinks they are all one container, and they are very patently not. I'm not dealing with this issue. Instead, as of last year, we started a project to re-inventory all of the record groups, and we are starting from scratch and creating brand new containers, and there will never be another box one in university archives so long as I am employed there. So then on the completely flip side, of all the issues that we had after updating to 1.5, we also had lots of finding aids that had no containers whatsoever associated with them. Typically, it was either because it was a really tiny collection, a single volume, a single folder, maybe a single box, or because, again, really early on when they started creating the EADs, they would slap up a collection-level EAD and then just attach a PDF inventory for all of the boxes. So looking to the medium term, we were planning to use the public user interface, and we wanted to take advantage of the Aon ArchivesSpace integration, so that we've already had it on the Primo side for all of our published materials. There's a little Get at Spencer button where folks click on that, and then it just takes them to their Aon account. They're able to log in, request the item that they want, print the call slip. It's all beautiful. So we wanted to do that on the ArchivesSpace side for our archival materials as well. So in order to do that, everything needed to have a container. So the really tiny collections, we assigned students to take care of those. We were pretty confident that using the extents information, they'd be able to go, yeah, this looks like it's folder 1 or box 1 for this collection, and they would just add an instance at the resource level. For the larger collections that had PDF inventories, it was typically me, maybe another staff person, who was adding, in this case, really, really bulky containers. I mean, 46 boxes for one instance, but at least it's something better than nothing. So everything that I've talked about so far is focused on our accession and resource records. I haven't even talked about other issues, both internal to ArchivesSpace and our importing, and external to ASpace, that had nothing whatsoever to do with whether or not things were importing all right. And I'm going to touch on these really super quickly. So Malaka had a graduate student work on cleaning up subject headings in our instance in 2017. She generated a spreadsheet report of every subject heading we had in the system at that time, and Jeff Dutton merged duplicative headings, fixed spelling errors, and updated to current Library of Congress subject headings. And then there were issues that a graduate student simply couldn't handle, like one collecting area just having no authority control whatsoever over their subject headings, and another collecting area adding lots of agents, but not explaining why those agents are attached to that finding aid, so bad cataloging practices. And some of that are things that we're still finding as we deal with them. And so, of course, we were doing all of this cleanup between 2014 and 2020 at the same time as processing and cataloging new materials in a kind of other duties as assigned way, and then the pandemic happened, and our cleanup work intensified, particularly in 2020 when we were either not in the office at all or for just very brief periods of time. So one of our cataloging team began tackling the agent records in earnest as one of her main work-from-home projects. Going through the alphabet, she enhanced names using RDA rules and investigated names in order to come up with additional authority control when she could. She also imported from LCNAF if somebody had that kind of authority record and we only had a local record in our system. And at the same time, she was enhancing our local authorities in our Voyager catalog so that information in the two separate systems more closely matched. She didn't do this always for donor names in particular. Historically, donor information was not being added to our Voyager catalog records, so we do still have some Mrs. Smiths floating around and other issues that still need to be cleaned up. And additionally, after the version 2.7 upgrade that changed how languages are handled in ASpace, we had more cleanup to do, not nearly as bad as the container cleanup. Malacca had long ago set our system to default to English for most users when they were entering data. This way they didn't get that little yellow pop-up box that asked, are you sure you don't want to add a language? So this was fine for lots of our collections, especially when this data wasn't publicly displaying. But it did mean that after version 2.7, when that functionality changed, anybody who was processing in addition to a collection, some file and series and subseries objects would say English and others wouldn't, so it would be wildly inconsistent. Also, sometimes that English was getting added to file folders that were very definitely not in English. They were in Spanish or French or German or all kinds of other optional languages. What we ended up doing for this, what we're doing now for language information is the default is still English at the resource level. We add language information as needed, either at the resource level or below, depending on if there are non-English materials in that collection. For the cleanup, I had a staff person, again, Malacca ran me a spreadsheet, and the staff person went through and added language codes for those resource records that had the MUL, multiple languages code, so that we actually had, like, here are the 4 languages in this collection. And she also checked everything that had a non-English code beforehand, just to make sure that it all upgraded the way that it was supposed to. I then also asked one of our IT staff, Saran Tran, he was on the Technical Advisory Council not too long ago, to run a script to get rid of all of the now extraneous English at the file and other lower levels of the hierarchy, because all of that information and sometimes misinformation had been appearing both in the public user interface, which we started using in 2020, as well as in all the PDFs that folks were printing out. And then we did some other stuff, but there's a webinar, go check that out. So the upshot is, I am here to tell you that it can be done. Last summer, I hired 2 new staff, and there really wasn't that much cleanup left to do. There are a few straggler projects, I've touched on a couple of them today, but now we're really looking at how can we enhance our data instead. And I'll go through these really quickly. So one thing that I've actually got a graduate student working on right now is creating biographical historical notes for collections in the regional history collection that didn't have anything prior. And if Caitlin Stewart, if she can't glean enough information to warrant creating a biohist note, she'll add a revision statement instead, either saying that she could not find any information or that she added like a sentence to the abstract, something like that. So that if we run this kind of report again, there'll be something to go, oh, don't bother. There's no more research to be done. We're also in the planning stages for doing a full physical inventory of the regional history collection with the intention of barcoding containers that have not yet been barcoded. We started doing that probably around 2011, so there's a lot of collections that don't have any barcodes at all. And that also means that we'll be able to catch anything that doesn't have a finding aid or a catalog record. Malacca's been overseeing a similar inventory for all of the printed materials in the building for the past 10 plus years, so I'm hoping to make use of her expertise because I'm pretty worried that the manuscript collection will not go as smoothly. And we're also more fully embracing the collection management functionality that ArchivesSpace provides, namely the container management. So our stacks manager, who also does some accessioning, has started adding locations to containers associated specifically with the faculty papers from the university archives, because those boxes have actually been reshelved to just be fully based on space rather than call number, unlike the rest of our collections. We've typically just kept that information in a spreadsheet. We are making use of Aeon's functionality so that that location information will print to the call slips so that pages and other folks who are just looking for this one box can find it more easily and more quickly without either having to go back into ArchivesSpace or having to go find that spreadsheet. And that's my marathon. Thanks, everybody.